The room felt cold, the sound of papers shuffling and distant footsteps echoing in the air. Ethan couldn't help but feel a knot in his stomach as he waited. It was hard to believe he was here, in this place, having to face the woman who had hurt him. His mind raced with everything that had led him to this moment: the confrontation in the parking lot, the way Karen had yelled at him, then slapped him hard across the face. He tried to push the memory away, but it stuck with him like a bad dream. He glanced around the room, taking in the faces of strangers. The judge's bench was high up, looming over everyone. He could feel the weight of the situation press down on him as he sat in the hard wooden chair. Ethan's eyes met the defense table, where Karen sat, her face pale, but her eyes hard with defiance. She looked like she didn't regret a thing. The anger that had burned in her eyes the day of the attack was still there, but today was different. Today, Ethan wasn't just a victim. He was standing up for himself, and he wasn't going to let Karen walk away without consequences. The trial was about to begin, and Ethan was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that he had done the right thing by bringing this to light. Ethan sat nervously in the cold, sterile police station. His hands were clammy, and his heart raced as he waited for Officer Reynolds to return. He had never expected it to come to this. Being arrested wasn't something he'd ever thought about, but now here he was. And Karen, the woman who had slapped him and damaged his car, was still as angry and entitled as ever. When Officer Reynolds walked back into the room, she gave him a reassuring smile, but Ethan could tell she knew how tense he felt. "Don't worry," she said. "She's not going anywhere. Once we finalize everything, Karen will face more than just an arraignment." Ethan nodded, but his thoughts were still clouded. He couldn't stop thinking about how Karen had tried to twist the situation. She'd attacked him, but somehow, she was acting like she was the victim. Her words from that day echoed in his mind, her threats, her accusations. It was hard to believe she had the nerve to act like nothing had happened. But Ethan wasn't going to back down. He had done the right thing by pressing charges. Now, the only thing left to do was wait for the next step. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, Ethan felt like he had control over the situation. He could finally stand up for himself. The courtroom was quiet, except for the soft rustling of papers and the shuffle of people settling into their seats. Ethan sat in the back, feeling the tension in the air. His heart was beating faster than usual, and his hands were sweaty, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was at the moment he'd been waiting for. The trial was starting. He looked around. The judge sat high on the bench, her eyes scanning the room with a serious expression. Ethan had heard about her. Judge Simmons was known for being tough but fair. At the front of the room, Karen sat with her lawyer, her face as pale as a ghost, but her jaw was tight, her defiance clear. Ethan didn't look at her for too long. He had enough on his mind. The prosecution was up first. The lawyer, a woman named Ms. Hayes, stood and addressed the jury. She carefully laid out what happened, how Karen had started the argument, slapped him, and even damaged his car. Ms. Hayes painted a clear picture, showing that Karen was the one who had caused all the trouble. But when Karen's lawyer stood up to defend her, Ethan couldn't believe what he was hearing. He tried to make it seem like Karen wasn't to blame, asking the jury to feel sorry for her. Ethan's frustration grew. How could they possibly think Karen was the victim? As the trial moved forward, the tension in the courtroom became almost unbearable. Ethan's eyes were glued to Ms. Hayes, the prosecutor, as she took her place in front of the jury. Her voice was calm but powerful as she began outlining the case. She started by reminding everyone of the evidence, the photos of Ethan's damaged car, the eyewitness accounts, and the messages Karen had sent. Every word painted Karen as someone who had acted out of spite and anger. The jury leaned forward, their expressions serious, as Ms. Hayes made her arguments clear and logical. Ethan felt a small glimmer of hope. Maybe justice was on his side after all. But then Karen's lawyer, Mr. Thompson, stepped up for the defense. He was tall and confident, with a smooth voice that demanded attention. He walked up to the jury, his tone shifting to one of sympathy and understanding. "Let's not rush to judgment," he began. He claimed that Karen was under emotional stress, suggesting that her actions were not intentional but rather a reaction to her situation. His words twisted the narrative, making Karen sound more like a victim than someone responsible for the chaos she caused. Ethan's stomach twisted in frustration. Then came the cross-examinations. Ms. Hayes fired sharp questions at Karen, challenging her story and pointing out inconsistencies. But Mr. Thompson was quick to defend her, skillfully deflecting the points. The back and forth between the lawyers created a gripping atmosphere. Ethan could see the jury's uncertainty as they looked between him and Karen. The stakes were high, and the outcome felt more unpredictable with every passing moment. Ethan clenched his fists under the table. Would the truth prevail, or would Karen's version of events sway the jury? Karen stepped onto the witness stand, her expression carefully composed, though her hands betrayed her nervousness as they fidgeted in her lap. She glanced briefly at Ethan before turning her gaze to the jury. Her lawyer, Mr. Thompson, approached her gently, asking questions in a tone that painted her as the misunderstood party in this tangled mess. Karen's voice quivered slightly as she began to tell her story. She described feeling pushed to the edge by Ethan's behavior, claiming he had been manipulative and dismissive during their relationship. Her words painted a picture of herself as a victim, trapped in an emotional storm. The jury listened closely, some nodding, others watching her with cautious eyes. Ethan clenched his fists under the table. This wasn't the Karen he knew. This was someone twisting the truth to save herself. When Mr. Thompson finished, it was time for Ms. Hayes to cross-examine. She approached Karen with sharp precision, her questions calculated to reveal cracks in Karen's story. If you felt so threatened, why didn't you go to the authorities earlier? Ms. Hayes asked, her tone calm but firm. Karen hesitated, her confident demeanor faltering for a moment before she quickly recovered with a rehearsed-sounding answer. Ms. Hayes pressed further, pointing out inconsistencies between Karen's testimony and the evidence. The tension in the room grew as Karen struggled to keep her story straight. Her once confident tone turned defensive, and beads of sweat appeared on her forehead. Ethan could see some jurors exchanging glances, their initial sympathy for Karen wavering. As the cross-examination ended, the courtroom felt charged with anticipation. The truth seemed closer than ever, but whether the jury would see through Karen's performance remained uncertain. The courtroom grew silent as the lawyers prepared for their final statements. Mr. Thompson, representing Karen, stepped forward first. His tone was measured and calm, his words carefully chosen to sway the jury. He spoke of Karen as a woman pushed to her limits, claiming she had acted in desperation and fear. Imagine being trapped in a situation where no one hears your cries for help, he pleaded. His argument painted Karen as the victim, asking the jury for understanding and mercy. Then came Ms. Hayes, Ethan's lawyer. She strode to the front with a confidence that filled the room. Her voice was clear and firm as she pointed out the inconsistencies in Karen's story. We cannot let emotions blind us to the facts, she said, her words slicing through the tension like a knife. She reminded the jury of the evidence, the gaps in Karen's timeline, the unanswered questions, and Ethan's unwavering account of what happened. The jury deliberated for hours, the weight of the decision pressing on them. When they finally returned, the verdict was read aloud, not guilty. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, relief washing over him. The courtroom buzzed with mixed reactions, but one thing was clear: justice had taken its course. As the courtroom emptied, Ethan sat silently, his mind swirling with emotions. He was free, but the weight of the trial lingered heavily on his shoulders. He replayed Karen's tearful testimony in his mind, wondering if she truly believed her actions were justified. How had their once happy friendship come to this? Outside, Ethan's family and friends waited, their faces filled with relief and joy. Yet, Ethan couldn't shake the lingering sadness. He had fought for his freedom, but he had lost something priceless along the way: trust in people he once held dear. The case had opened his eyes to the fragility of relationships and how quickly they could crumble under pressure. Karen, too, faced her own reckoning. Sitting alone in her apartment, she stared at a framed photo of their group, taken years ago when life seemed simple. She had lost the trial, but more than that, she had lost a friend. Guilt and regret intertwined, making her wonder if things could have been different. In the end, both Ethan and Karen carried scars from the ordeal, lessons etched deep into their hearts. Life would move on, but neither would forget the painful journey that had changed them forever.